Hello and welcome back to The Halfway Point. When most people think about the challenges facing general practice, they often think about workforce, funding, patient demand, digital transformation. But behind all of those things sits something equally important: governance, structure, and having the right foundations in place to support the sustainable and successful organisations. Today we're going to explore why specialist advice matters, what makes a strong and stable partnership, and how practices can work effectively across organisations as primary care continues to evolve. And to join me in this discussion, I'm delighted to be joined by Alison Oliver, who is a partner at Sintons LLP, who advises GP practices alongside our primary care colleagues and other organisations on the governance, partnership, mergers, contracts, and collaborative working arrangements. So, Alison, thank you very much for joining us today. And to start with, if you can give a little intro on yourself and the work you and Sintons are doing, that'd be great.
Yes, thanks Ben, thank you for having me. Yes, so my name's Alison Oliver and I'm a partner in the commercial healthcare team here at Sintons. I've been advising GP practices probably for around 20 years now, so I've seen a lot of changes in that time. Obviously, the kinds of work that I deal with are at practice level, helping with things like partnership agreements, when things go wrong, providing advice on dispute resolution. And more recently, a lot of the work that I do is around collaborative working and how practices work together, either within GP federations or within primary care networks.
Okay. And I was going to ask, actually, what are some of the biggest challenges you've seen across the sector over the recent years? I wonder if like with healthcare, we have the pre and post COVID. Is it the same in your world? Is there a different world now where we're post COVID, shall we say?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what comes across my desk is around, I mean, there's the bread and butter stuff that we get all the time, around just practices, the challenges of working in a partnership and so on. But I think probably one of the themes throughout my career has just been that constant change and the fact that, I've seen PCTs and CCGs and ICBs, there's always something for practices to get their head around, and, as if their day job isn't challenging enough.
Yeah. That's a really good point. We joke, we love a three-letter acronym in the NHS, don't we? So on that sense, then, what are you seeing from your perspective? What are some of the issues that kind of the leaders in primary care are talking about most at the moment? What's the hot topics?
Okay, well, a lot of the work that I'm doing and have been doing really since the start of this contract year has been around readiness for these long-awaited single neighbourhood provider contracts and multi-neighbourhood provider contracts. And it really is kind of permeating every tier of the system. So individual practices are thinking about it. Primary care networks are thinking, okay, so if we switch from a DES to a NHS standard contract, say, for the single neighbourhood services, what does that look like for us? How do we organise ourselves in the best way to be able to deliver those services? And then at federation level, lots of conversations depending on really the size and current effectiveness of the federation. So if bigger federations are obviously a lot of them are feeling quite ambitious to become the multi-neighbourhood providers in their own right, or certainly to take the lead on certain multi-neighbourhood pathways. But also, then the smaller federations thinking, well, we don't necessarily satisfy that 250,000 footprint that the neighbourhood framework is talking about. So what can we do, and how can we work with other federations on our patch to be able to work collaboratively to be able to effectively participate in multi-neighbourhood delivery?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. And I was just thinking about, as you were saying that, as we're coming together, I suppose underpinning that is the arrangements, is the contracts. Yeah, you mentioned about the DES and LESs that are coming up. What, in your view, makes a collaborative arrangement successful?
Trust, communication, clarity about roles is the main thing. So
Okay.
Without wishing to sort of seem disparaging, I think a lot of people that work in health, they can get to the trust point, but then the clarity point, it starts to fall over. So if you're going into a collaborative arrangement with any organisation, whether it's your practice or your PCN or your federation, it's really important that there's clarity about the respective roles of the different parties to the collaboration. what are you each bringing to the table? What are your expectations? And if that's not kind of nailed down, that's when things can fall apart later on. So it really is important that you have some kind of agreement where you're clear about the purpose of the collaboration and what your respective roles and rights and obligations are in that relationship.
Okay, and is that built into the contracts for the NHS, or is that a separate agreement? It's similar to like a partnership agreement that neighbourhoods, PCNs should establish?
Yeah, so it kind of depends really. So our NHS standard contracting and subcontracting documentation doesn't really lend itself to like proper what we would call alliance contracting. So
Okay.
in a genuine alliance contracting arrangement, you might have multiple delivery partners who are all party to this same contract and jointly responsible for delivering it. But we have quite a linear, the NHS contract, standard contracts are quite linear. So what they envisage is more around, you have a lead provider, the lead provider is responsible for delivering these services, and then you have the standard subcontracts flowing from that. So at its least collaborative, you could work purely with those subcontracting arrangements. So you have your lead provider, and the lead provider enters a series of subcontracts with various other parties who will deliver different elements of the services. But if it's intended to be a genuinely collaborative arrangement, then that subcontracting suite of documents might not be sufficient. For example, you might want to have a collaboration agreement that starts off with the bidding process and the decision that you are going to jointly bid for services and what your roles in relation to those services will be. And then going forward, you might have something between the different subcontractors, say, who, elaborating how they will work with each other, because otherwise those subcontractors only have a direct relationship with the head contractor and not necessarily with each other.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, very up and down rather than left and right. Mm-hmm. That kind of gets me thinking, do you think kind of the existing governance models are sufficient with a broader kind of neighbourhood approach, or do you think we'll start to see new structures emerge with that? We talked about practices and federations of PCNs. That was all, in comparison to neighbourhoods, very small scale. Working with colleagues, we know, even distantly know, whereas now neighbourhoods is going into other primary care sectors, more into the community, that side of things. It's a world that we might not be aware of. So is the existing structures enough, do you think, or do you think they will evolve over the coming years as well?
I think they will evolve, and I think they'll have to evolve because again, in a way, when you're talking about other sectors, so at least sort of within the health sector, everybody has similar kind of contracting mechanisms. So if you're a practice, you're going to have a GMS contract or a PMS agreement or an APMS contract. If you're a hospital or a community provider, you'll have an NHS standard contract. But if you're, some of the other sectors, they'll have they might be commissioned by local authorities, for example. So the contracting mechanisms are going to be quite different. The funding lines are going to be quite different. So everybody has these sort of contractual obligations with their commissioner to deliver services. So it's important that there's kind of an agreement about how you bring those different people working in different sectors together to be able to both satisfy their own contractual obligations to their commissioners, but also work together in a collaborative way.
Okay, so one kind of final question then on neighbourhoods. What should leaders be considering now to prepare for the future with neighbourhoods? So we've seen kind of, at the time we're recording this, the Kent have been the first to kind of publish their arrangements with the ICB, and I'm sure possibly even by the time this goes out there'll be others. But kind of what at grassroots level should we at practices be looking at to go, how do we prepare for whatever our equivalent of a Kent or whatever the next area is? What should we be doing now, really?
Well, I mean, having a relationship with the commissioner and having early conversations with them. So the Kent arrangement is a local variation agreement. So you'll have seen that although we don't yet quite know what these new single neighbourhood provider contracts will look like, certainly as an interim measure, we've now got this option of varying the DES at local level to include additional enhanced services. So try and have conversations with the ICB about what kinds of pathways might be available for your area. And also, communicating well with the other practices within your PCN, communicating well with your local hospital trust. When we're talking about, what PCNs should be doing and GP federations is developing that good relationship with the trust, because they are the organisations, let's face it, that are best equipped to hold some of these contracts, because they have the scale and the infrastructure. And there is always a risk that it will kind of move out of the control of primary care if you don't actively engage in conversations and be proactive about what you can do.
Yeah, true.
And of course, before that, what you need to do is take stock of your capability. So look at your own organisation and evaluate, what are your strengths, what are your weaknesses, what can you do to improve, and to be able to demonstrate that you're capable of operating at this kind of scale.
Okay. That's really helpful then. So that's a broader neighbourhood approach. If we look at it as a small practice I say small, but even practices now are very large, but as an individual practice then, or a collective PCN federation, it seems to be that a lot of organisations only seek the legal advice when a problem kind of arises. But what I've picked up on is the most valuable advice happens long before that point. So kind of why is specialist primary care legal advice so important, do you think?
Well, one of the biggest frustrations for me is when you get, whether it's practices or PCNs, and things start to go wrong, and what they haven't got is a proper agreement in place about the relationship. And if you haven't got that legal agreement in place, firstly, disputes and disagreements are more likely to arise because you haven't had the conversation of thinking about how you want to run your organisation, whether it's your practice or your PCN, and actually the process of developing a legal agreement to govern that relationship can in itself be quite a good collaborative exercise, because it forces the people within the organisation to think about how they want to work together. Then you have your legal agreement in place, and it means that if certain situations arise, you have a roadmap for how to deal with those situations, and you can sort of point to your rule book and say, well, okay, I appreciate that you think this, but what we've agreed and what we've set out in this agreement is that we will deal with that particular situation this way, and it can kind of nip things in the bud. If you don't have that agreement in place and everybody has slightly different ideas about how to do things, then, and you have nothing legally binding in place to govern the relationship, you then find yourself having to navigate the more general legal framework. So in the case of partnerships, for example, you're governed by the Partnership Act, which is not going to be particularly helpful for a modern general medical practice, for example. So I think the difficulty with getting non-specialist advice is that non-specialists might not, really know the kinds of things that can arise in general practice. So when we're preparing a partnership agreement, a lot of what we will include in a partnership agreement is informed by previous partnership disputes that we've dealt with, because that's identified for us areas that can commonly lead to disagreement. So when we're working with a practice, we can use that experience to inform our discussions with the practice about what should go into their agreement. So that's where the specialist thing comes in. But really, my primary message to all my clients is, invest in an agreement. I would much rather you paid me to prepare a partnership agreement than pay me 10 times more in some cases to resolve a dispute. And that's the thing to bear in mind. It's easy to try and make shortcuts, but then when problems do arise in the future, it can be a lot more costly to resolve.
And even with the financial element to one side, the time and the stress and disruption, I've known practices that have had disagreements for over years,
Yeah.
And the run on and the knock on effect, the practice manager who it's hard to stay almost neutral in when you're getting different sides from a different partnership disagreement, but then the staff and the patients, the impact is way broader than
it's absolutely devastating.
Right,
yeah. And it can be really, terrible. And I've had multiple clients over the years who've, they've been talking to me on the phone in tears, because it just permeates every aspect of somebody's life to be involved in those kinds of legal battles with your colleagues. It's just something that you need to try and avoid at all costs.
So is there something, so if people are listening and thinking, they're not sure whether they need advice on something, what's the red flags? What's the warning signs, if you like, when actually it should be a case of let's just get some advice, even if it is just that at this stage, and go to a specialist like yourselves? What do you think for that?
Are you talking specifically about perhaps if a disagreement has arisen?
Yeah, so we could say there's grumblings in the partnership. There's little things popping up. How to nip it in the bud, stop it from going any further.
Yeah, I mean, I think you should always try and resolve things amicably if you can. But what I would always say is if there is something rumbling in your practice and you think it might be problematic, it's always worth taking legal advice early. And because even if you want to resolve it amicably, it's helpful to understand your legal position and to sort of shape your strategy according to your legal position and what options might be available to you. And again, one of the problems that can arise is that you might have a problem with a particular partner, say, who's not pulling their weight or something like that. And sometimes, quite often, as sort of a pattern that I've noticed in my work is that the other partners will kind of not address it for a long time and kind of sweep it under the carpet because it's uncomfortable and difficult to deal with, and then suddenly everything kind of blows up and they'll serve notice on that partner to expel them, say, just
0 to 100,
yes, exactly, yeah. And so what I always say is, well, if something like that is happening, get the advice early. What are our options and what should our strategy be? And I think lawyers get a bit of a bad reputation for being hard litigators and so on, and actually we're not. Even our kind of dispute resolution team, who are those hard litigators when they need to be, their focus in the early stages is always, how can we try and resolve this amicably? How can we try and negotiate our way out of this situation? And part of being able to negotiate your way out of a situation is understanding what your legal position is and what your options might be further down the line, so that what you do now you're not shooting yourself in the foot in terms of what you might be able to do later.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So focusing on that's very much almost treating it when it's got to that stage. I think one of the successful things, you mentioned the Partnership Act earlier on, the partnership model in general practice, and then underpinning that is the partnership agreement. And that's kind of been the foundation of general practice for, well, almost since the beginning, actually. So why do you think that partnership model, that partnership agreement, has stood the test of time for general practices over 70, 75 years now?
Yeah, well, it's a very flexible business model. That's its main benefit. Limited companies are really good and very good for sort of very high risk, larger scale working. But at a professional partnership level, they are a very flexible model. The difficulty with them is that, as you've mentioned, the Partnership Act applies to the extent you don't vary the provisions of the Act, and not all of the provisions of the Act are particularly helpful. So, for example, any partner could give notice to dissolve the partnership. And if that's done acrimoniously and there isn't clear agreement between all the partners about what happens to the NHS contract, then that contract could well be terminated by the Commissioner, because the Commissioner can't get involved in internal disputes between partners. So it's really important to have a written agreement between you that says no partner can dissolve the partnership unilaterally on notice. What you do is you have a series of provisions that deal with how a partner can leave voluntarily if they want to, or can be expelled in certain situations if their behaviour or conduct merits it. But if you don't have that agreement saying those things, then you have no way of dealing really with a problematic partner, or without dissolving the partnership, which is not
the nuclear option.
Move. Yes, it's a nuclear option. So really, it's very important to have that agreement in place that makes clear that partners might come and go, but the partnership as a whole continues to deliver services for patients under the NHS contract. And having provisions in it about things like annual leave and holiday and sick leave and maternity leave, how decisions are going to be made. All of those things are really important, because the Partnership Act doesn't go into detail about those. So the assumption under the Partnership Act is that all the partners are equal. They all have an equal share of profits, an equal share of capital, an equal share of workload. And that's not really how general practice works. So it's much better to have that written agreement in place that makes clear what the partner's entitlements are to leave, how profits will be shared, how you'll deal with disputes and that kind of thing.
And you mentioned there about limited companies. That seems to be a hot topic at the moment, especially with neighbourhoods and the evolution there. What's the questions organisations should be asking if they're a practice partnership that's thinking about a limited company? What are some of the things they need to be aware of to make that decision, whether that's right, to see whether that's right for them?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So practices do have the option of incorporating their practice and moving their NHS contract into a company. It's not something that we see a lot of, but we certainly see more of it in the at-scale organisations, like with primary care networks. We're getting a lot of them looking at incorporating practices, and of course, the big benefit for forming a company for any kind of business is the limitation of liability on the members of that business. So as things stand in any kind of unincorporated organisation, whether it's your practice partnership or whether it's your primary care network, the liability of the members of that arrangement is potentially unlimited. And while that's it might be acceptable at practice level because, you're working with a smaller group of partners and you have more direct control over how the business is run on a day-to-day basis. When you're talking about at-scale working, it's more of a risk on the individual practices. So that's why I think we're seeing a lot of primary care networks have already formed companies, for example, to employ the shared workforce, and why now primary care networks are thinking about forming companies with a view to holding these future single neighbourhood provider contracts if and when it moves out of the DES framework.
Yeah, got you. Okay. That's helpful. And then so going back on the partnership then, kind of when should an agreement be reviewed? I guess an obvious case is if you're doing a big practice merger or something like that oftentimes then you review it then. But should there be kind of, if nothing's changed in the practice, when is a good time to look at the partnership agreement, see if it's still relevant? How often should we be looking at it?
I mean, I would say, shake it off, dust it off, give it a read through at least once a year, just to kind of check, is this still saying what we want it to say? Has anything changed? So some practice partnership agreements still don't make any reference, for example, to primary care networks.
Interesting.
And you probably would want something in your partnership agreement saying, well, how are we going to pick our representative on the PCN board, and what are their roles and responsibilities in relation to the partnership. But so annually, I'd say is a good benchmark. Just have it. It doesn't mean you necessarily need to update it at that point, but at least check it and see whether it's still got everything in it that makes sense for your practice, whether anything needs to be changed. And then you should always review it if there's any big change in the partnership. So you mentioned mergers, but also a partner leaving, a partner joining. If you're perhaps taking on a new lease of premises or moving premises, any of those kind of major changes, you should be updating the agreement.
Okay. So it should almost forms part of the checklist. So anything that changes at the top, let's take an afternoon, let's look at the partnership agreement and see how to reflect that. Okay. And one of the other things that's happening traditionally, the partnership model was GP partners, seeing more non-clinical partners or other clinical sectors. So whether that's practice management or pharmacists or nursing, so what advice would you give to, this is initially primary care managers listening to this podcast, but those that are thinking about partnership, whether that's the individual or the practice or both, what's some of the things to consider when going from that salaried model to a partnership model? Okay,
that's a really good question. We are seeing a lot more practice managers becoming partners, but as you said, also nurse practitioners, pharmacists, and so on. So, I mean, you need to think about the fact that you will no longer have employment rights. If you become a partner, you effectively become self-employed, and there are pros and cons to that. So you would lose your employment rights. So the only real rights that partners have that are comparable to employees are under laws or anti-discrimination laws. Those still apply in a partnership. But otherwise, you would lose the right, for example, to your unfair dismissal, that kind of thing, and the working time regulations, those kinds of things. And then there are tax differences. Obviously, you're taxed differently, and I'm not a tax advisor, but your accountant would be able to advise you on that. But it's really important that you, if you are thinking of making that switch, to get proper advice on it, and make sure that you see a copy of the partnership agreement.
Yeah.
And make sure that you understand that, because lots of new partners join a partnership and they just sign the agreement and they don't read it or understand it. And I've had situations where new partners have come to me and said, my partners are saying this, but I don't agree. And then I look at the agreement and I'm saying, yeah, but you signed the agreement that says what they're saying. So it's important to read that and make sure that it reflects what you think it should reflect. And in the case of non-GP partners, you're likely to need some changes to the agreement, because if the agreement has been drafted on the basis that the partners are all GPs, which a lot of practice agreements are, then you may well need to include some provisions that are adapted slightly for the non-GP partners.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So that's really helpful. And as a wrap up, a question: what excites you the most about the future of general practice? So with your years of experience, I suppose, and reflections on how we've got to where we are today, kind of what do you see and what's exciting to you about the future of general practice?
I do think there's a real opportunity for general practice to be much more proactive and to shape what's happening in the healthcare system. And I think general practice consistently demonstrates that it's, innovative, adaptable. Patients are right at the forefront of everything that general practice does. And having worked with GPs for 20 years, I get slightly annoyed when they get a bad press. Because the vast majority of GPs are doing a fantastic job. And like I said, it's about, all these, I think with all the changes that are going on, there is opportunity. There are also threats, but I think practices just have to try and look to take advantage of those opportunities and hopefully help to be at the forefront of a more patient-centred, integrated health and care system.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Alison. It's been really fascinating to get your views today. And I think kind of in conclusion, it's, as primary care continues to evolve, keeping those strong foundations, those clear agreements, and utilising trusted advice from like Sintons, for example, and professional healthcare legal advice, I think becomes increasingly more and more important. So thank you very much again, Alison, joining us today. Thank you all for listening. I hope you have a good week, and we'll see you next time at The Halfway Point. Thanks, Alison.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you for joining us today for another episode of The Halfway Point. We hope today's conversations have given you a fresh inspiration and practical ideas you can take straight back into your practice. You will find all the links and resources we mentioned in the show notes at locumpm.co.uk. The Halfway Point is available on all major podcast platforms in both audio and video formats, so you can tune in however suits you best. If this episode helped you, we would generally love to hear from you. Leave us a review or a comment. Not only does it make our day, it also helps us shape future episodes around what matters most to you. Make sure you follow and subscribe so you do not miss next Wednesday's episode. And if you know a colleague who would benefit from this conversation, please share this episode with them. You can also connect with us on LinkedIn and Facebook by searching for the Locum Practice Manager. We're on YouTube too, where we share practical tips and tutorials for primary care managers. Until next time, keep moving forward, keep improving, and we'll see you again next week at The Halfway Point.